You ever picture ancient Rome as sunshine, olives, and togas flapping in a warm breeze? Yeah, scratch that. Because winter in the Roman countryside could kill you. Not with swords, but with silence. With frost that crept under your tunic. With nights so long and cold that even the goats shivered. And no, the average Roman peasant didn't have a fancy hypocaust or marble villa to warm their toes. They had mud walls, smoky air, and a family huddled like firewood. This isn't a story about Roman luxury. This is a story about bare survival. The kind where sharing body heat with livestock wasn't weird. It was wise. T8.F. If that shocks your toga-loving heart, go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment on what surprised you most. Now let's step inside a peasant's winter and leave your romantic myths at the door. Thermal architecture, semi-sunken villas, and earth wall homes. Forget white marble columns and sprawling villas. The average Roman peasant didn't live in a postcard. They lived under it literally. To survive the bone-chilling winters of the Italian highlands, the Gaulish plains, or the mountainous Balkans, peasants dug deep into the ground. Semi-sunken homes were a common sight. The floor might sit a foot or two below surface level, shielded from icy winds and buffered by the natural insulation of soil. These weren't elegant constructions. No symmetry, no elegance, just raw survival logic. Walls were made from thick-packed earth, adobe bricks, or roughly cut stones, whatever the land gave them. These thick walls acted like thermal batteries, soaking in what little heat the sun gave during the day and slowly releasing it at night. Sunlight was a blessing, but rare in the winter. So they worked with what they had. Windows, tiny slits. Sometimes no glass, just animal hide or oiled cloth stretched across an opening. Doors were heavy wood, low to the ground, often wrapped in cloth to prevent drafts. The ceiling? Low. Claustrophobically low. Not by accident, but by design. Smaller spaces are easier to warm. A high ceiling may be grand, but in a Roman winter it was suicide. And the roofs? Packed thatch, layered with mud and pressed with stone weights to resist wind and trap warmth. In some regions, turf roofs were used, literally living grass and dirt above your head. Strange? Maybe. Efficient? Absolutely. Even floors were built with intention. A peasant might pack the earth hard, then lay animal skins, straw, or woven reed mats on top. Some homes had hollow floor sections where warm air from cooking fires could be trapped for a few precious hours. These homes weren't beautiful. They were burrows in the earth, built by people who understood the brutal honesty of nature. Stay warmer, don't wake up at all. You don't need central heating when the ground itself becomes your blanket. The hearth and hypocaust. Fire below, warmth above. Let's clear something up right away. Hypocaust, those legendary Roman underfloor heating systems? They were real. They were genius. And no, the average Roman peasant never had one. Those marvels of engineering were reserved for the wealthy, patricians, rich merchants, or state bathhouses. They required brick subfloors, raised on pillars, stoked with constant fire, and maintained by laborers with way too much time on their hands. But peasants? They had something far more humble and far smokier: the hearth. At the literal center of the peasant home sat a modest fire pit. Not a fireplace with a chimney, not even a brazier. Just an open pit dug into the earth or built up with stones used for everything: cooking, boiling water, heating flatbread, and keeping the family from freezing stiff in their sleep. It smoked. A lot. And that was part of the plan. Roman peasants weren't just tolerating the smoke. They wanted it. Smoke rose and warmed the ceiling. It lingered in the rafters, killing bugs and drying the roof. It helped preserve meat hung from hooks. It even warmed the bones of the house before escaping through cracks in the roof. No chimney? No problem. The entire house was the chimney. Now, some clever families mimicked the rich by building primitive hypocaust-like features. In regions where stone or tile was affordable, they might channel warm air beneath sleeping platforms, using flat clay tiles or raised bricks. Even a clay floor with fire-heated stones could stay warm for hours after the fire died down. One common trick: the heat stone. Before bed, large stones would be placed in or near the fire. Once hot, They'd be moved into beds wrapped in clotharily hot water bottles without the water. Children, elders, and the sick clung to them through the long winter nights. Fires burned low after dark to conserve fuel, so the hearth's placement was critical. Often, it was slightly sunken and centrally located, allowing everyone to sleep nearby. In some homes, ashes from the hearth were spread over the floor to retain heat longer and to smother odors. A family might not have luxury, but they had strategy. They didn't heat the whole house, just the heart of it. In the Roman countryside, warmth didn't come from gadgets. It came from fire, sweat, and learning how to make embers stretch until dawn. Smoke and insulation, mud, straw, and controlled leakage. If you walked into a Roman peasant's home in winter, your first reaction wouldn't be, "How cozy." It would be more like, "Am I choking? Is this house on fire?" Because yes, it was full of smoke. But that wasn't a mistake. That was intentional engineering peasant edition. See, smoke had a job. Several, actually. First, it was the only reliable pest control in a world without bug spray. The smoky haze repelled flies, ticks, fleas, basically every creature that wanted to share your body heat or your blood. Second, and more importantly during winter, smoke helped trap warmth. It rose and clung to the low, soot-stained ceilings, warming up rafters, walls, and even the hay packed into gaps between roof beams. The walls didn't radiate like modern heaters. But over time, the combination of smoke, soot, and heat-storing mud made the air inside slightly less deadly than the air outside. That was a win. And let's talk about those walls. Forget plaster or polished marble. A Roman peasant's walls were made of wattle and daub, a fancy term for sticks and mud. Woven wooden slats packed with a mix of clay, straw, dung, and earth. Thick, breathable, and surprisingly durable. Like a medieval thermos made from whatever was lying around the farm. The thatched roof above, layered reeds or straw, compressed with dirt or ash, maybe even old rags. If you were lucky, you added a thin stone slab layer to keep out rain or snow. Insulation didn't mean keeping the cold out. It meant trapping the family's heat, inhuman heat, animal heat, even steam from boiling soup counted. But not all heat was welcome. That's where controlled leakage came in. Houses weren't airtight not because peasants didn't know better, but because they couldn't afford to suffocate. A few gaps were left between wall slats or roof beams, just enough to let smoke eventually drift out. Some homes had smoke holosmal, deliberate gaps near the top of the wall, often covered with cloth that could be lifted like a flap. It was a delicate dance. Too much smoke, you'd pass out. Too little, you'd freeze, and the bugs would move in. And no one wants to wake up coughing, covered in lice and frozen stiff. So if your modern insulation has triple-layer windows and thermal foam, congratulations. But back in ancient Rome, all you needed was some mud, straw, and a good relationship with your local goat. Adaptation through centuries, from republic to empire. Let's take a slow walk through time. From the dust of the Roman Republic, around 500 BC, to the zenith of the empire, around 300 AD. The winters didn't change much, but how people survived them definitely did. If you were a Roman peasant in the early Republic, your house was basically a mud-covered hole with a roof, crude huts, round or oval structures, thatched roofs so thin a determined bird could fly through. Your insulation, your own skin. But peasants weren't stupid. They watched, copied, and learned. As Roman military campaigns swept across Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania, they brought home more than loot, they brought building ideas. Suddenly, rural folks started borrowing techniques from the very people Rome had conquered. Irony? Poetic. By 100 BC, peasant homes began to straighten up. Literally, round huts gave way to rectangular forms, wattle and daub walls were now thicker. Roofs sloped smarter, windproofing improved, and surprise more houses started going semi-subterranean. Why? Because the Gauls did it, and it worked. During the early empire, especially under Augustus, building materials became slightly more accessible. In some regions, brick kilns popped up near estates. If you worked for a landowning elite, chances are you could borrow a few bricks or get paid in them. Your mud hut might now have a stone base, a status upgrade from earthworm to mole. But despite progress, rural inequality never thawed. Villas owned by patricians had tiled roofs, glazed windows, and maybe even radiant floor heating. The peasants working those estates? Still freezing, still smoking in their own homes, just doing it in slightly more rectangular fashion. The biggest change wasn't in material set, was in mindset. Roman peasants began to think long-term. They stored firewood more carefully, dug deeper root cellars, plastered walls more thoroughly before winter. Some even split their dwellings into zones, a sleeping zone packed tight for warmth, and a livestock zone right next door, often only separated by a wooden barrier that the goat could easily ignore. And while the elites debated architecture in marble forums, the poor were engineering survival with spit, straw, and strategic family snuggling. So no, Roman peasants didn't experience some glorious evolution in comfort. But over centuries, they became experts in suffering more efficiently. And if you're sitting in a centrally heated apartment complaining about the cold, just remember, your ancestors once burned dung inside a mud hut and called it innovation. Winter routines, aligning daily life with the sun. You wake up, it's cold, still dark. You want to roll over and sleep another hour. Good news. If you were a Roman peasant in winter, you probably would. Because long before alarm clocks and 9-to-5 jobs, the sun was your schedule. And in winter, that meant you started late, finished early, and prayed your goat didn't freeze before you did. Here's the thing. Wintertime wasn't just colder, it was shorter. Not in days, but in usable light. In many parts of the Roman Empire, especially the northern provinces, daylight barely stretched 8 hours. And so peasants adapted not by fighting nature, but by flowing with it. Morning? Forget sunrise. Most families didn't stir until smoke rose from a neighbor's chimney. That was the ancient version of, okay, I guess we're doing this. Breakfast, if you can call it that, was more like fuel-loading hot porridge, reheated scraps, maybe a crust of bread dunked in oil if you were lucky. Work hours? Condensed. Shorter tasks took priority, fixing thatch, feeding animals, fetching firewood. Everything had to happen between mid-morning and early afternoon because once the light faded, it was over. You don't herd sheep in the dark. You get eaten. You don't mend fences at twilight. You lose fingers. Midday? That was your best chance at warmth. The sun, if it appeared, gave you 2 precious hours of bearable cold. Many peasants took an extended break not out of laziness, but out of strategy. Huddling indoors during the coldest chunk of the day, late morning to early afternoon, conserved energy and, more importantly, preserved firewood. Afternoon? You rushed. Everything happened fast. Feeding livestock, hauling water, cleaning soot, preparing for the long, long night. Dinner was early, usually just before sunset, because no one wanted to cook in pitch black unless they had to. And besides, firewood was precious. Every minute of flame counted. Evening? Quiet, cold, huddled. You'd sit close to the hearth, maybe sew, maybe pray, maybe just exist. Families might tell stories, hum songs, or plan the next day's firewood rotation. Some days, the entire goal was just to make it to tomorrow. This rhythm wasn't about romance. It was about maximizing heat, minimizing exposure, and staying alive in a world where sunlight was the only clock, and darkness was always hunting. So next time you snooze your alarm and mumble, just 10 more minutes, congratulations. You're living the luxury version of a Roman winter routine. The night watch. Fire tending as a family duty. Midnight in the Roman countryside. The stars are out. The wind howls. The fire, it's dying. And if it dies completely, so might you. Welcome to the peasant night shift, where the job isn't glamorous, but it's critical. Keep the fire alive or freeze trying. You see, Roman peasant homes didn't hold heat well. Even with mud walls and straw roofs, the cold crept in through every crack like an unwanted ghost. The hearth fire, small and smoky as it was, became the single most important tool of survival, and it had to burn all night. But here's the catch. Firewood was precious. It wasn't just lying around in convenient IKEA bundles. Every stick had to be chopped, hauled, dried, stored, rationed. Burn it too fast, and you'd be out by Saturnalia. Burn it too slow, and someone might not wake up in the morning. So families came up with a system. Rotating fire watch duty. Elders too old to haul grain? Perfect candidates for night fire duty. Children over 7? Congratulations, you're now the backup ember blower. Sometimes it was the mother, sometimes a slave, sometimes the person who lost at that day's household argument. Their job was simple but relentless. Wake up every hour. Check the coals. Add a handful of dried twigs or dung. PD fan gently with a reed mat. Try not to wake the baby or step on the goat. This wasn't heroic. It was quiet desperation. Someone wrapped in 3 tunics, eyes half open, hoping the coals catch before their fingers go numb. No torches. No lanterns. Just flickers of orange in a room full of snoring, shivering bodies. And if the fire did go out, you didn't just start another. You had to walk to the neighbor's house and beg for a lit ember carried back in a clay bowl or wrapped in damp cloth. Shameful? Maybe. But solidarity was stronger than pride in winter. And let's not forget the backup plan. Ash banking. Peasants learned to bury live coals in a mound of ash to keep them smoldering. No flame, no smoke, just a hot core that could reignite with the morning breath of kindling and hope. So when you tuck into your electric blanket tonight, remember, your ancestors were taking turns whispering to the fire, hoping it whispered back. Because in ancient Rome, the family that tended the flames together stayed alive together. First sleep, second sleep, broken nights in cold homes. You think waking up at 3 a.m. is a modern problem? Nope. It's ancient and intentional. In fact, if you lived as a Roman peasant, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't insomnia, it was just part of the plan. Enter the old world sleep model, first sleep and second sleep. This wasn't some quirky village habit. It was common from ancient Rome all the way to medieval Europe. Especially in winter, when darkness swallowed over half the day, peasants naturally slipped into biphasic sleep, 2 distinct periods of rest with a waking window in between. So what happened during this middle-of-the-night window? Well, you'd stir awake around midnight, not from a nightmare, but because the fire needed feeding, your bladder was full, or the goat had stepped on your face again. Then came the in-between time, a strange, sleepy twilight zone when you weren't quite asleep, not quite fully awake. Families would whisper quietly. Some would tend embers. Others would kneel on the cold floor to pray, or mend clothes by candlelight, or, sometimes sneak in some adult time under the furs. Because let's face it, there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. Even ancient Roman writers referenced this second sleep ritual. It wasn't weird, it was weather logic. You couldn't stretch 8 hours of daylight into productivity. So you stretched the 16 hours of darkness into manageable chunk sleep. Break, sleep again. And let's be honest, this system worked with the realities of ancient winter homes. Remember, the hearth fire would be dying. Someone had to get up anyway to poke the coals, add twigs, maybe relight the stew pot or warm a stone for grandma's knees. And when the job was done, back to sleep usually curled tighter than a snail under a blanket made of wool, straw, and possibly another person. This broken sleep wasn't inefficient, it was adaptive. It made cold nights less dangerous, more manageable, and weirdly communal. Your entire family might be awake together in the dark, huddled around fading firelight, sharing silence, soup, or stories. You weren't alone in the dark. You were part of a quiet choreography of survival. And today, when you wake up at 2 a.m., roll over and stare at your phone with dread, remember, your ancestors were already up. They just didn't have TikTok. Baking for the village, communal ovens, and body heat. Imagine this. It's dawn in a Roman village. Frost clings to the ground. Your breath comes out in puffs. And the warmest place for miles? A giant mud oven in the middle of the street. Welcome to the communal bakery, hearth, and heated hope of every freezing Roman peasant. You see, not every family could afford to build their own oven. Wood was scarce, clay was expensive, space inside the home was tight. And honestly, why struggle with fire and smoke when your neighbor already has a perfectly good oven you can mooch off of? So, villages built one big Avena hulking, dome-shaped structure made of stone, brick, or packed clay, shared by everyone. It wasn't just a kitchen, it was a thermal lifeline. Here's how it worked. Every few days, usually during the coldest part of the week, someone, usually the unlucky early riser, would wake before dawn to light the fire. They'd burn logs for hours until the inner walls of the oven glowed red hot. Then they'd rake out the ashes, and the entire village took turns baking flatbreads, porridge cakes, root vegetables, chestnuts, even drying herbs or warming clay jugs of water. But the oven wasn't just about food, it was about heat. While the bread baked, people gathered around. Children ran barefoot in circles to warm their limbs. Elders leaned their backs against the warm outer walls. Sick folks sat on hay bundles nearby, soaking in heat like it was divine therapy. The heat radiated for hours after the baking was done, and Roman peasants used every second of it. Some brought wet clothes to dry. Others brought goats to sleep nearby. And yes, some just lay down beside it and took a nap in public because dignity is less important when your nose is turning blue. And after the last loaves were pulled from the oven, families would carry home warm embers in clay pots wrapped in damp cloth or animal skin to reignite their own hearths. One oven, dozens of fires. More than bread, this oven-baked connection. It was a place where gossip traveled faster than smoke, where arranged marriages were whispered, where neighbors forgave arguments over warm crusts and shared honey. And in a world where central heating didn't exist, a hot rock filled with bread smoke was basically heaven. If you've ever hugged your radiator in winter, now you know how they felt about that oven. And yes, some people showed up just for the warmth, no bread, no business. Just toes, hands, and desperation pretending to be sociable. Clay jars and cellars. Ancient Roman refrigeration. You walk into a Roman peasant's home in the middle of winter. It's dark. It smells like smoke and onions. You ask, "Where's the fridge?" They look at you, confused. Then gesture to a corner of the dirt floor where a large clay jar sits half buried in the earth, its lid sealed with wax, cloth, or, let's be honest, dried pig bladder. Congratulations. You've just met the ancient Roman refrigerator. Here's how it worked. Clay jar samphire, if you want to get fancy, weren't just for wine. They were multi-purpose life-saving devices. These tall, narrow, porous jars were buried partly or fully underground to take advantage of the Earth's stable winter temperature. It didn't freeze down there. It didn't spoil. It just quietly kept things less terrible. Inside, you might find salted fish packed in oil, dried figs, a stubborn block of goat cheese that could double as a weapon, lard, leftover millet gruel from 2 nights ago, congealed into something resembling emotional trauma. In richer households, there were dedicated cellars. But for peasants, it was usually just a pit lined with straw, occasionally reinforced with stone or clay, and sometimes shared with rodents. Because if the mice wanted in, they got in. But here's where it gets clever. These jars didn't just preserve food, they helped heat the house. Wait, what? Let me explain. Some peasants placed jars filled with fermenting foods, think pickled vegetables, sour milk, soaked legumes in low hollows near the sleeping area. The fermentation process, especially if packed with straw, gave off a tiny amount of heat. Not enough to roast your toes, but just enough to take the bite out of the floor. And in a world where warmth was worth more than wine, that mattered. Plus, clay jars could double as thermal mass. After baking day, some families placed warm stones or embers inside empty jars, sealed them up, and used them like ancient space heaters, slowly radiating heat for hours while the family slept nearby. Efficiency? Genius. Smell? Debatable. But perhaps the most underrated function of these jars was psychological. In the dead of winter, when fields were frozen and the goat refused to look you in the eye, lifting a lid, and seeing preserved food meant hope. It meant you'd made it this far and might just make it through. In a world with no buttons to press, no lights to blink, and no hum of machinery. A half-buried jar was the line between survival and starvation. So next time your fridge beeps because the door's been open 3 seconds too long, think of your ancestors whispering, "Please don't freeze," into a pot of lard. The peasant diet, calories, fats, and survival strategies. Let's get one thing straight. The average Roman peasant didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to not die. And in winter, that simple goal got a lot harder. No fresh produce, no flowing wine, no street vendor shouting, "Fresh olives." Just a cold house, a smoky room, and a pot of something gray bubbling slowly over a tired fire. Welcome to the survival diet of ancient Roman peasants during winter. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Instagrammable, but it got the job done. At the center of it all, poles. Poles was the peasant's best friend and worst enemy, a thick porridge made from millet, barley, or emmer wheat. Boiled with water, sometimes wine if you stole it, flavored with onions, herbs, or the occasional scrap of meat fat, it was glue. Warm glue. Nutritious glue. Glue that kept your insides moving and your body from freezing. Protein, rare but not absent. Salted fish, imported and then rationed like treasure. Dried broad beans, and cheese, specifically full-fat goat cheese so hard you could chip a tooth on it. If you were really lucky, a bone with some meat clinging to it. More likely, just the broth it once touched. Fats were life. Literally. In winter, calories equals heat. So peasants hoarded fat like gold. Lard was stirred into everything. Oil, usually olive in the south or animal fat in the north, was spooned onto bread, rubbed on skin, even burned for light when desperate. And speaking of bread, don't expect white, fluffy loaves. Roman peasant bread was coarse, dense, and sometimes full of grit, not just metaphorically but literally. Stone-ground mills often left tiny shards in the flour, so over time people's teeth got worn down just by chewing. Sweetness? Extremely rare. Maybe some dried figs or honey on feast days, but in winter, sugar cravings bowed to salt, fat, and heat. Water? Icy and probably full of bacteria. Most people drank diluted sour wine or boiled grain water. Kids drank goat's milk if the goats hadn't frozen yet. And no, there were no 3 meals a day. You ate when food was hot and the fire was strong. Usually just 2 meals morning and dusk getting together around the hearth like prisoners sharing secrets. But for all its bleakness, the peasant diet worked. It was designed not for taste, but for survival's low-digesting grains, long-lasting fats, and minimal waste. They didn't count carbs. They counted days until spring. So next time you complain that your soup is bland or your toast is overdone, just remember, a Roman peasant would have cried tears of joy over your freezer-burnt lasagna. Sleeping together, family piles for warmth. Close your eyes and imagine your ideal winter bedroom. A soft mattress, heated blanket, maybe a warm mug of tea. Now erase all of that. Welcome to Roman peasant winter sleeping, where the only real insulation was your cousin's body heat and a wet goat's breath on your toes. Let's start with the bed. Actually, let's start with the floor, because most peasants didn't have a bed. At best, they had a raised wooden platform. More likely, it was a pile of straw, old sacks, animal skins, and anything that could absorb heat without catching fire. Now cram everyone into that pile. Mother, father, grandparents, children, the occasional in-law, and yes, slaves, servants, even the family dog. Sleeping arrangements weren't organized. They were stacked. The smallest and weakest went in the middle, the human burrito strategy. Adults lined the edges to block wind. The goat? Probably somewhere between your knees, chewing something that used to be your tunic. And privacy? Hilarious concept. You didn't sleep alone because you were poor. You didn't sleep alone because you wanted to live. The goal was body heat, shared respiration, combined warmth. You'd fall asleep to the sound of snoring, farting, fire crackling, and someone whispering, "Don't roll over, you'll let the cold in." Blankets? Maybe. If you had wool or woven cloth, it was patched and thin from years of use. Many used animal skins for side-in. Others just wore all their clothing to bed, including head coverings. A tunic, a cloak, and another tunic were the Roman version of pajamas. In colder regions, families slept with clay pots of embers under the straw. Dangerous? Extremely. But better scorched toes than frozen ones. And let's not forget the smell. Sweat, smoke, wool, damp hay, and goat. No one was complaining though nostrils froze slower. When you were buried in company, sleep posture was strategic. Curled, fetal position equals warmth. Back to back equals efficient. Face out equals I drew the short straw. Face in equals please don't breathe on me, Uncle Gaius. And if you woke up needing to pee in the night, good luck. Stepping out of the pile was like diving into an ice bath, so most people just held it or used a shared chamber pot in the dark by feel. You didn't sleep well, but you slept warmish, and in the Roman winter, that was enough. So next time you sprawl across your memory foam mattress under 3 layers of plush, be grateful you're not sandwiched between your grandfather and a flatulent sheep. Layered tunics and wool, dressing for the cold. Forget fashion. Forget color coordination. In a Roman winter, the goal wasn't to look good, it was to not die of frostbite before breakfast. And so, the Roman peasant wardrobe in winter became a chaotic, itchy, slightly smelly battle plan made of wool. Let's break it down. First layer. The inner tunic usually made of coarse wool or cheap linen. If you were lucky, it had only 1 hole. If you were rich, it had 2. But this layer wasn't about luxury. It was the base. The warm hug of poverty. Second layer. Another tunic. Possibly thicker. Possibly stolen from a cousin or a hand. Me down so old it remembered the Republic. This second tunic might be belted to trap heat, or simply left to hang like a soggy towel in a cold bathhouse. Then came the woolen cloaka, big, itchy, rectangular piece of cloth, wrapped around the shoulders like a toga's grumpy cousin, often fastened with a crude pin, sometimes just tied in a knot. It wasn't stylish, it wasn't comfortable, it smelled like wet goat. But it worked. Need more warmth? Add fur. Peasants didn't go hunting for it, they scavenged it. Old rabbit pelts, scraps of sheepskin, strips of worn leather stitched together like a patchwork quilt of desperation. A peasant child's winter coat might be made from 3 different animals and 1 unlucky pillow. Footwear? Questionable. Some had wrapped rags or leather sandals with wool stuffed in. In colder regions, people wore improvised boots made of bark strips, fur, or padded felt. Most were barely waterproof, and none were comfortable. But hay-numb toes are still better than frostbitten ones. And let's not forget headwear. Roman peasants often tied rags, scarves, or even old grain sacks around their heads to preserve precious heat. Some men wore woolen caps that made them look like angry gnomes. But that gnome was warmer than you. The golden rule? Layer or die. Every item was reused, repaired, resewn, turned inside out, passed down. Some tunics had been worn by a grandfather, then an uncle, then the family goat, and then you. That's not an exaggeration. That's recycling Roman style. Style wasn't measured by trends. It was measured in degrees of not freezing. So the next time you complain that your North Face jacket isn't warm enough, remember, your ancestors were wrapping burlap sacks around their knees, praying to Jupiter that this year's lice didn't bite too hard, bringing animals inside, living with livestock. When the Roman winter got crueland, oh, it did. Peasants had 2 options. 1. Shiver alone in the dark. 2. Invite the animals in. Guess which one they chose? That's right. In the depths of winter, Roman peasant homes turned into warm, wheezing, clucking ecosystems where man and beast shared space, smells, and survival instincts. Let's set the scene. It's midnight. Outside, frost coats the olive trees. Inside, your family's crammed into a corner under a pile of wool and straw. And right beside you, a goat, snoring like an old soldier, a pig, radiating more heat than your brother, and somewhere in the rafters a chicken plotting its escape. Why did they bring animals indoors? Not for fun, not for love, for heat. You see, livestock generate body warmth, a lot of it. And in a world without radiators or central heating, a full-grown pig is basically a portable furnace. Goats, sheep, chickens, even dogs, anything warm-blooded was welcome, as long as it didn't knock over the fire or step on the baby. Many peasant homes were built as longhouse shaft for humans, half for animals, separated only by a wooden partition, or sometimes just a line drawn in straw. In smaller huts, there was no division. The animals slept next to you, underfoot, sometimes on top of you, and if they were chickens, occasionally on your face. But warmth came at a price. The smell? Biblical. The noise? Constant. The hygiene? Questionable at best. You didn't just wake up to someone snoring, you woke up to mooing, clucking, or a pig trying to eat your blanket. Still, peasants knew it was worth it. The animals survived the cold, the family stayed warmer, and in the morning you had eggs, milk, and the lingering scent of livestock stew in your clothes. Plus, animal presence acted as a kind of organic alarm system. If a fire started or a wolf got too close, the goat would scream before you even opened an eye. Loud, panicked, and undeniably helpful. And if you think this is unhygienic, it was. But dying of cold was worse than stepping in pig dung. That's just math. So next time your dog jumps on your bed and you push it off with disdain, remember this. Your Roman ancestors would have said, "Move over. The sheep needs room too." Because in ancient Rome, when winter struck hard, survival didn't come from solitude. It came from sleeping with your dinner. Passive heating, airflow, compost, and the warm wall trick. Not every Roman peasant could afford firewood. Actually, most couldn't. So they got creative. Not with gadgets or gods, but with physics, fermentation, and manure. Welcome to the wild world of passive heatingware. Staying warm in winter meant working with the environment, your animals, and some really enthusiastic compost. Let's start with the basics. Airflow. Many peasant homes were built with intentional ventilation route-screwed channels beneath the floor or along the base of walls that allowed hot air from the hearth to move, slowly and stubbornly, into sleeping areas. You didn't need ducts. You just needed a path, gravity, and a lot of hope. Some peasants placed curved tiles or stacked pottery shards under bedding platforms to capture and redirect warm air from fires. Warm air risesso. They trapped it, funneled it, and slept on top of it. Brilliant, if slightly smoky. Now for the weird part. Compost. Yes, rotting dung. A pile of fermenting animal waste, straw, kitchen scraps, and spoiled grain wasn't just a nuisance set, was a slow-burning heat source. Peasants placed compost piles adjacent to their homes, often against the outer wall of the sleeping area. The heat released during decomposition would radiate through stone or mud brick and slightly warm the wall from the outside in. Does it smell? Absolutely. Does it work? Absolutely. Some homes even had internal compost pits, small ones, tucked under raised bedding, insulated with straw and sealed with clay tiles. A peasant might literally be sleeping over a pile of rotting cabbage and goat dung and be thankful for it. And then there was the warm wall trick. One side of the house, usually south-facing, was built extra thick, often with sun-baked bricks or flat stones. During the day, the wall absorbed what little sunlight winter gave. At night, it released the stored heat slowly, radiating warmth into the room like a primitive radiator. Add a sleeping pile pressed right up against that wall, and suddenly the cold night became tolerable. Not cozy, not luxurious, but less likely to kill you. Survival wasn't about roaring fires and wool cloaks. It was about stealing heat from everything: air, earth, even rotting vegetables. So the next time you hear the term eco-heating, just know Roman peasants did it first with compost, cracked pots, and a very forgiving nose. You didn't survive a Roman winter by being strong. You survived by being connected. Because no matter how thick your cloak or how clever your fire-tending tricks were, one household alone couldn't outlast the cold. It took a village, literally. A neighbor shared embers when your fire died. A cousin traded grain for wool. Children huddled in groups during baking day. And when wood was scarce, everyone rationed together, not because they were kind, but because they were smart. If one house froze, the others felt it. You watched over each other's goats, took turns guarding the oven, helped the old widow patch her roof before the first frost. In a world where there were no thermostats, no delivery apps, and no safety nets, community was the only infrastructure. And yet, here's the irony. We tend to romanticize the past. We imagine Roman winters as cozy scenes, flickering firelight, togas wrapped around contented families, olives on the table. But the truth is far less poetic. Winter was brutal, homes were dark, food was rationed, the cold bit through everything. But people endured, not with technology, not with comfort, but with each other. Maybe that's the real warmth we've lost. So if this story made you shiver, made you think, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Would you have survived a Roman winter or just made friends with a goat and hoped for the best? Because in the end, Roman peasants didn't survive because they were tough. They survived because they never froze alone.